All right, for chapter 8, we're going to be looking at articulations or joints. And this is a chapter that has a lot of vocabulary terms. And so this is a great place to start making some flashcards or, putting all of your vocab kind of in a journal or some type of a notebook together. It's not a difficult chapter, but again, there's a lot of terminology, a lot of words. So let's kind of start out by looking at what is a joint. Most of us realize this is just where two or more bones come together, they connect. We're going to be talking about a couple of different um, classifications. Not every joint is the same, articulation is the same. So we need to look at some different categories of joints. As far as functions go, when bones come together, that may enable some movement there. And we'll talk about some of the well-known joints like your shoulder joint or hip joint or elbow joint and some of those characteristics. Joints also provide some stability for that particular area. And so we'll look at what types of things like ligaments provide stability for that particular joint. There's joints known as synovial joints. They happen to be very stable type of joints, but we need to look at what goes into that synovial type of a joint, the capsule and all of that. And even a little bit of bone growth is associated at the joint space, at that articulation. And so there is an area known as the epiphyseal growth plate that is where it's basically an area of growth of your long bones. And so you've got actively dividing cells in that growth part or that growth plate of that long bone. It is generally a temporary joint because after you reach a certain age and you mature, then those bone cells, they completely ossify there, and so that you have the calcium phosphate matrix is filled in, it's calcified, and so growing stops at those long bones. But technically that's still a joint because you have two portions of a bone coming together there. So let's look at some categories. You can generally look at joints in two main categories. The first one here is functional. How do they function? It really means how much motion, how freely movable, or are they movable? How much range of motion is at that particular joint? And so you can see on the slide there's three examples here. And again, some difficult looking words, and so find some way to kind of start working with these and practice these words. Flashcards are great. Quizlet, whatever app you want to try to use. Synarthrosis. Again, notice here for each of these, you've got this the ART as part of this, and so articulation is the name for joint, and so that's part of the root word here. Syn means kind of knot, and so synarthrosis is a joint where you have two bones coming together that it doesn't move. There is no movement there. And so kind of the classic example in the skeleton is your sutures. We'll talk about in a few minutes. Sutures in the skull. They are, like your sagittal suture, your coronal suture, occipital suture, or the lambdoid suture going around the occipital bone. These are non-movable joints. They're still joints. They still have characteristics of bones coming together, but they're not moving. So this is a synarthrosis type of a joint. Amphiarthrosis means you can move them. There is some movement there, but not very much. A good example here is the joints where you have vertebrae in the vertebral column coming together. So two vertebrae coming together. There is some movement there, but very little movement in the vertebral column. What we most of the time think of when we think of joints are probably the freely movable type of joints. These are your synovial type of joints we'll look at. These are called diarthrosis as far as the joint goes, and that just means that you have the more range of motion. So your shoulder joint or your hip joint or your elbow joint or the joints in your digits, all of these would be diarthrotic type of joints. So this is one way. This is looking at joints based on their movement. That's called functional classification. The other thing is you can look at it based on the structure of that particular joint. And that is determined by what kind of connective tissue that you find here in that joint. And so there's two main categories. We're going to look at the third one a little separately. But two main categories. When we talked about connective tissue, we talked about cartilage, and we looked at different types of cartilage. And so here you've got two examples of joints that differ based on what kind of cartilage is found there. So we have fibrous, cartilaginous, and then, like I said, synovial is almost like a category by itself. It is a structural example, and it has its kind of structure all different than really the fibrous and cartilaginous. So let's look at the first two first, and then we'll continue on to synovial. So fibrous joints. We're talking about fibrous connective tissue holding these joints together. So these are a little more structurally supported type of joints, fibrous connective tissue. This is including the collagen fibers, some very dense type of connective tissue holding these joints together. There's no joint cavity here. That's really reserved for your synovial joints. And again, we'll look at that last. You really don't expect to find much movement, if any, here. And so we'll look at three examples of fibrous joints: sutures, we mentioned already, syndesmosis, and a gymphosis. So the first example here would be a suture, just like we looked at in lab. And so you see in the image here, you've got the top of the skull, or the skull cap, cranial area, the frontal bone, separated by that coronal suture, parietal bones, then separated by the sagittal suture and the occipital bone with the lambdoid suture. And notice that it says up here that these opposing bones are interdigitated. They actually the edges here, it's almost like putting your fingers together, your fingers being intertwined. These bones, the ends of these bones are literally intermingled or intertwined into the next one. In between, there's actually a sutural ligament, which is made up of periosteum and some connective tissue here, dense fibrous connective tissue or collagen fibers that are part of this suture. The second example of the fibrous joint here is the syndesmosis. And in this case, it's a joint where the bones are slightly farther apart than something like a suture. You still have ligaments here. In this case, the ligaments are tightly holding the two bones connected here. You can have some movement here, not very much. The example that you see here, this is of course, the radius and the ulna. And so this is referred to as the radio-ulnar syndesmosis, the type of joint that it is. The bones up here, that head of the radius is where, and you've got the little radial groove here, that little notch. That's where you can get a little bit of rotational movement up here, but not very much. And again, these bones are very close together, and they're structurally supported with these ligaments. The last example is called the gymphosis, and the word is telling you here that technically means you have a peg-like structure that is stuck or fit into a socket type of a joint. And the classic example here is your teeth. Even though your teeth are not counted as a bone, they do have some similarities in that they have that bone matrix that we've talked about. And so they're held in place inside of a socket type of a joint, held in place by ligaments or connective tissue. And so this is a special type of a fibrous joint known as a gymphosis. The other type of joint here is called cartilaginous joint. The second structural type of joint, cartilaginous joint, means you are separating the bones by cartilage. And of course, the two main types of cartilage that we've talked about is hyaline cartilage and fibrocartilage. You do see elastic cartilage, but that's not really found here in a joint. So you'll find hyaline and fibrocartilage here. So two examples that we're going to be looking at is a synchondrosis, that is a cartilaginous joint that contains or has in it hyaline cartilage, and a symphysis, and that's a cartilaginous joint that is composed of fibrocartilage. And I'll show you one or two main examples for each one. Now, for long bones, we already know that you do have hyaline cartilage at the ends of the bones. We kind of talked about that, but in a long bone that has not completely finished growing, you have that epiphyseal plate. I mentioned that at the beginning of the lecture. The epiphyseal plate or the growth plate that creates a type of a temporary joint between the end of the bone or the epiphysis and the long portion of the bone, the diaphysis. And so you have, by definition, this is a joint articulation. I've got two technically separate bones that are divided here by this growth plate. And so this is referred to as a synchondrosis because we have hyaline cartilage that is basically inside of this growth plate along with the actual bone cells. That's why this is temporary, because eventually those bone cells will completely ossify and you'll no longer have the growth plate here. You may see the line that would be here, the epiphyseal line. Some synchondroses that would be more long-term or permanent that could be found in the rib cage. And so you have what's called the sternocostal synchondrosis. And so here you find that you do have cartilage that separates or connects the ribs to the sternum. And so the root word here is costal, that refers to the ribs, and you got sterno for sternum. And so you have cartilage here, and again, we're dealing with hyaline cartilage, so that's why this is categorized as a synchondrosis. The other example here is symphysis or symphyses. And so you have a symphysis is where you have fibrocartilage uniting two bones. Inside of that joint, you would have fibrocartilage. You may have some movement here, but again, not very much. And so this is kind of your example of your amphiarthrosis type of a joint. The examples here are the symphysis pubis. That's a little bit of fibrocartilage that you find between the pelvic bones or the coxal bones in that pubis region. You have a little bit of this in the sternum. Here's your image of the sternum. There's the body and the xiphoid process here at the bottom. And so you have a little bit of this fibrocartilage that separates these two sections of the sternum. And then lastly, we mentioned the fibrocartilage pads or discs that you have between the vertebrae. So that would be technically a symphysis type of a joint. The last category of joints we'll look at are synovial joints, and they really fall into their own category because they are structured much differently, because they have a cavity that you don't see in the other two categories, structural categories of joints. So just a couple of quick facts about synovial joints is that they do have a fluid that's known as synovial fluid, and we'll talk just a little bit about that. And so that fluid is necessary for have smooth movement of that joint. You're gonna have a lot of movement here. Now, not all synovial joints have the exact same range of motion, range of movement. We'll talk about specific examples. So, for example, your hip joint, even though it's a synovial joint, it doesn't have as much range of motion as your shoulder joint does. And so really we're talking about the appendicular skeleton when we're looking at the synovial joints, and they are more complex. And I'll show you kind of the book image in just a minute. Some of the main features or parts that you're going to find is that the synovial joints are going to have a capsule around it. That capsule has a fibrous connective tissue. It's a dense irregular. That's got connective tissue wrapped around that capsule area. This is actually coming out from the bone itself, the periosteum, that outer layer of the bone. So it is continuous with the actual bone. It has an inner membrane, the synovial membrane, that's going to be lining that joint capsule on the inside. And this is where you have cells that are producing synovial fluid. Now, here's a little description about the synovial fluid. It is a mixture of different ingredients. It's got some polysaccharides there, and so carbohydrates. It's got some proteins, fats, and then some other cells that are part of that. One of the things that these cells are producing is hyaluronic acid. And so we mentioned this before because it's part of the ground substance type molecules when we talked about connective tissue. It's the uh, same molecule, same compound here we're dealing with, hyaluronic acid. The reason you find it here is because it helps to reduce friction, and it's very important to have a slippery type of a substance inside of the synovial joints, because these again are going to be your very movable joints. So you want to have everything you can to make a nice slippery type of a joint. It needs to be supported, and that support is going to come from those ligaments and that fibrous capsule around it. But you also want some things there in place to reduce friction. So when you look at this image of a typical type of a synovial joint, you can see that you've got two bones coming together. You can see on the ends of the bones, I've got some cartilage. Sometimes you see this referred to as articular cartilage, or remember, this is hyaline cartilage on the ends of the bone. I also see that I have a joint, synovial joint capsule that's made of this fibrous outer layer that goes around it. That outer layer is continuous with the actual bones, that fibrous layer of the periosteum there. And it also has an inner layer. That inner layer of the synovial joint capsule is basically the synovial membrane. This is what's producing the fluid that's inside, that's producing the cellular matrix that's going to have the hyaluronic acid in there. It's a water-based fluid, is all on the inside. This is also where you're going to find ligaments supporting the structure. We'll mention that, and even tendon, or the ends of the tendon, if you have, where the skeletal muscle is going to attach to this joint. A couple other things associated with the synovial membrane. This word bursae here, or bursa, is singular. The pockets of synovial membrane and fluid that extend up from a joint or down from a joint. If you notice here, again, you've got your two bones coming together. My joint cavity is here, but that joint cavity extends a little ways up from the end of the bone. So you got the end of the bone here, but that joint cavity extends upward. That creates a little bit of cushion space for that joint. Notice I've got blood supply coming in, I've got nerves coming in, and so it's a little bit of protective cushion area there. That's the bursa. Sometimes you've heard of individuals that may have bursitis. That's inflammation in this particular area, and that can put added pressure on the joint itself, added pressure on the nerves that are lining here as well, and that can create some pain, discomfort, and problems moving that particular synovial joint. You also find the tendon sheaths. I mentioned that. You've got the synovial protection, synovial site that surrounds the tendons close by, and of course you have ligaments for stabilizing that joint.